Hey, welcome to the Go-To Physio Podcast. My name is Dave O'Sullivan, and in this podcast, my aim is to give you 15 years of my experience in professional sport and private practice and share that knowledge so that you can get real-world results with your complex patients who have failed traditional approaches. I hope you enjoy the show. Hey, welcome to the Go-To Physio episode 47. Now, this is season 3, episode 13, if you are keeping count. Now, in today's episode, we're talking all about making sense of the objective assessment. So, in today's episode, this is an episode based on chapter 6 of my Amazon #1 best-selling book, Happy Progressing Patients. Now, if you haven't got a copy of the book, you can head over to thegotophysio.com/book. Pick up a copy if you want to follow along with this episode. Now, this is a very, very important episode today, and this is an episode that I think is something that I hear a lot of frustration from therapists when I talk to them on calls. When Shane and my team talk to therapists all over the world on calls, we hear the same frustration time and time again, and that is that when I've come out of university, the assessment that I have been given and the skills that I've developed in the real world, very, very often, the patient does not present like either the textbooks would lead us to believe or in a way that allows me to fully utilize my assessment skills that I have developed. Now, there's a big, big problem in my opinion on how we were trained as therapists, and that is that we were very much trained, and this isn't fault in our lecturers or anything like that, because they have a syllabus to follow, but ultimately how we were trained is to be able to help the average therapist just survive. Okay, so they go into their placements, they get a job, and they can survive. In order to thrive, especially in pro sport and private practice, we need a lot more than just what we are taught. And that's really where I look at the objective assessment, and I look at it in two different ways. You've got the first way, which is very much a diagnosis-based approach. Okay, so that's where when the patient comes in, we're looking at, say, for example, low back pain. We're looking at the low back. Okay, is it a facet? Is it a disc? Is it, what is the diagnosis? Okay, and absolutely, a nerve root problem, it's important to be able to pick up on that. And realistically, in the real world, we're going to be able to pick up at that in the subjective assessment. Is the pain going past their knees? Is it goes into their toes? Okay, and that's really important for setting patient expectations. Okay, but in terms of actually gaining information from the objective assessment and having power with that information to act, okay, because remember, power isn't knowledge unless you can take that knowledge, organize, and then implement it in the real world, okay? So when we go through a diagnosis-based objective assessment, very often we get a lot of information, but it's not information that empowers us as therapists to act in order to help the person. Okay, so that's step one, or option A, is more of a diagnosis-based approach. Okay, where we go into the objective assessment and we're hell-bent on getting a diagnosis. Now, that becomes very tricky when we actually then have to go, okay, we've done our subjective, we've done our objective, and I've spent so much time, energy, and concentration of focus on a diagnosis. But now, when I get to the end of the objective assessment, it's almost like I have to completely change direction again. Because now I have to speak to the patient and I give them a diagnosis, and what's the first thing they're going to do when they go home is they're going to go and Google that probably, okay? They're going to tell their friends and family the diagnosis, okay? So is that empowering our patients to act? Okay, is it empowering our patients to get back to where they want to be? Okay, and again, in the last episode, we talked about the importance of understanding the milestones, understanding where that patient actually wants to get back to. Okay, so that's your first option, which is a diagnosis-based objective assessment, where we're looking at the site of pain, we're looking at the body, and we're really trying to focus on a diagnosis. Now, if we contrast that with the Go-To Physio mentorship objective assessment that I teach in the mentorship, and that's what I like to term now, which I picked up from Louis Gifford in his books Aches and Pains, and that's more of a shopping basket approach. Okay, and I really like that term, shopping basket approach. He uses that quite a bit in his books, Aches and Pains. And when I read it, I was like, actually, I really like that. Now, before we just go and pick these things, and this is probably where I slightly maybe disagree or differ with what Louis Gifford said in Aches and Pains, in terms of we're just going through the objective assessment and we're applying the 3 clinical reasoning questions to the patient as we look at their assessment. And that is, number 1, are we actually looking at the root problem, or have we defined the root problem to be solved? So, for example, somebody has back pain. Are we actually, is the back pain the problem, or is it that something else isn't doing its job? And then we go on to question number 2, which is, what isn't happening, that if it was happening, this pain would no longer be a problem in the first place. Okay, so for example, if someone touches their toes and they get, shooting pain down their SI joint as they start the movement. Okay, well, we know the lower back shouldn't really be doing too much as that person reaches their fingertips, not even past their waist. Okay, so one of the first things that has to do there is the rib cage has to depress, retract, the diaphragm lengthens, the shoulder blades protract. Okay, so are all them things doing their job, which sets the lumbar spine up for success? Or are they have some protective strategies or movement strategies that them tissues aren't moving very well, and now straight away all the load's going back to the lower back? Okay, so that's an example of that question. Then we turn that question around and we say, well, what is happening that if it wasn't happening, this pain would no longer be a problem in the first place? Okay, so again, with that same back pain patient, well, if the lower back wasn't taking all the load as they go straight down, would that prediction error be present? And then ultimately, would that contribute towards a pain experience? So that's a really powerful way of looking at it. Now, you could essentially pull this apart, and if we're making the assumption that we're defining the root problem, that we understand, okay, that the symptoms aren't the root problem, and we just ask ourselves question number 2, when we go through the objective assessment, what isn't happening, that if it was happening, this would no longer be a problem? And that's where then we get back to Louis Gifford's shopping basket approach. And I think he does a really great job of outlining this in the books in the series Aches and Pains. So we'll go, okay, well, they're not doing this, they're not doing that, they're not doing that. This maybe isn't doing enough work. So again, the rib cage isn't doing enough work. Maybe they're not shifting their hip back a little bit. This, and this. They're a little bit guarded with that movement. And he talks about having all of these things into the basket, into the basket, into the basket. And, these are the things that we're going to be working on with the patient. Now, I think he was very clever in putting that out there, because what that does is that empowers us to act. So even if we're not 100% sure of a diagnosis, it's fine, because now we've got actual information and knowledge that's empowering us to act and actually do something with the patient that we could potentially get a change in symptoms. Okay, so you can see as you go through your subjective and objective assessment, we're building information that's empowering us to act as therapists. And when we can act, then we can bring about change. Whereas if we just go through a diagnosis-based objective assessment, a lot of that information, it's useful information to a point, but is it really empowering us to act to our full potential to ultimately help the patient? And we know from the literature that all our special tests and all of these things, they're not 100% accurate, they're not 100% valid, reliable, all of these kind of things, which is fine. So is it worth arguing that actually should we be going through our objective assessment and obviously respecting pathology, but ultimately going about it in a way that's going to allow us to gain information to act? Okay, so now, when we go back to Louis Gifford, I said that there was a couple of bits that maybe I differ with the mentorship approach than probably what he's talking about in the book. And that is then where we have all of this information. Okay, so we're getting all of these things where we're getting this information about what's not doing its job, that if it was doing its job, this pain would no longer be an issue. Now, here is the key bit. And this is the bit that's really going to differentiate you from everyone else. It's the ability now to prioritize all of this information. So sure, all of this information is good information. If we just act and we try to change these things, I'm sure we will help the patient. But the true art of this is being able to organize all that information and decide where to start first. Okay, and that is where really, in my opinion, we can differentiate ourselves from everyone else. Because that's where now we can make what I call a fast start with the patient and gain momentum. Okay, so for example, if we look at this approach and we were using the Go-To Physio meta model, where, okay, well, what's not doing its job here? We might have somebody, and I use this example sometimes with right side flexion. So when I reach my right hand down the outside of my right leg and I reach it down towards my knee, I get back pain. Okay, well, that's fine. And I noticed that actually when I looked at the patient, that the pelvis isn't, so when I reach down to my right, the pelvis isn't moving left. Okay, so again, we're not challenging our base of support with the hip. Okay, we're not staying balanced where we want to keep the center of gravity between the base of support. So we get that facet type traditional, my facets closing down and it's causing pain. Okay, that's fine. So we might have a scenario there where we go, okay, well, what's not doing its job here? Well, the hip isn't loading well. Okay, why is that? And we might find in the subjective assessment that actually they had an all ankle injury on that side. So maybe the hip isn't going outside the foot because the nervous system doesn't want to put load through that big toe, because if the hip goes outside the foot, that big toe has to contract to keep us balanced. So is that something? Now again, bear with me here. It's a working hypothesis. Okay, I'm not saying for definite that this is the thing, but bear with me. So we might have that one patient with right-sided facet, and we might go, actually, you know what, their hip isn't doing a whole lot here. Why is that? Now we could go and we could try strengthen the hip. We go, actually, in their injury history, they have an all ankle injury there. Okay, is it worth maybe looking into that a little bit more? So we might have that scenario, okay? We might have another patient come in with low back pain who's got no physical previous injuries, who's highly stressed, who's not sleeping very well. They've had trauma or high levels of continuous stress in their lives, okay? They're in essentially fight or flight, okay? They've got some maybe beliefs about their back that aren't helpful, all of these things. So we've got patient A, patient B with the exact same right facet joint type symptoms. Now, in terms of Louis Gifford's approach, we go, okay, well, this, and this isn't doing its job. We might need to look at that, and that, okay? But then for me, really, where we can go one step further and really build on his legacy and really take this to the next level is we can go back to the subjective assessment that we covered in last episode and make sense of the patient's story, okay? So for the patient with the all ankle sprain, that I may think that there's still some protective maladaptive strategies here around that ankle that's maybe causing the hip to not want to do a little bit more work than it should do. With that patient, I may be using module 3 in a mentorship where I'm desensitizing some of the peroneals, putting those tissues in a position where they've got no choice but to tolerate load, and then showing the nervous system that it's safe to tolerate load. And then when I recheck my key performance indicator, which will be that right side flexion, then I might say, actually, you know what, the nervous system now knows it's a little bit safe. It's safer to put load through the peroneals, update the belief systems, and now I might see a second order consequence where that hip is going to travel. Okay, so that will be an example of how I prioritize based on the subjective assessment knowledge that I've got from the subjective assessment. Now that gives me power to act. And the beauty of this whole using key performance indicators is I could do that with the ankle and I could be wrong. Okay, and actually, you know what? I do all this work with the ankle and it doesn't change right side flexion. Okay, the hip doesn't move, they still have the back pain. Okay, but at least I know now that I've tried it, I've retested it, and I'm going to reject my working hypothesis. Okay, so that could be your scenario A, where they've had a previous injury. Scenario B that I talked about, where the patient is highly stressed, lack of sleep, poor food choices, not exercising, essentially in fight or flight. For that patient, I'm going to go down a completely different strategy. Okay, so that's where now I would be using some of, at the end of module 1, I've got some breathing exercises, and also module 5 in the mentorship, it's all around the rib cage, getting the rib cage moving, restoring the ability of that diaphragm to lengthen. Why is that important? When we lengthen the diaphragm, we push him back into rest and digest. When we get him back into rest and digest, we essentially give them happy gas, okay? We improve their mood, we soften the mind, okay? We quieten the mind, okay? The prolonged exhalations, all of that stuff, heart rate goes down, blood pressure drops, okay? We relax the patient, we get them out of fight or flight. So I might use some strategies with breathing techniques where I'm getting that rib cage moving, I'm getting the diaphragm to go through a full range of motion, and I'm maintaining that exhalation for a little bit longer just to push them out of fight or flight. So you can see with that patient, I've used a completely different strategy. So 2 back pain patients, 2 right facet type, right facet joint, whatever the classifications are, I don't even use them anymore if I'm being completely honest, so I don't know the correct terminology, I apologize. But we've got right facet joint type irritation, let's say, for example, okay, if I write that in my notes. So we've got one patient with an all ankle injury, one patient that's just highly stressed. Where I'm going to start with that patient is going to be completely different. So 2 the same types of symptoms, 2 completely different treatment plans. And then the graded exposure, okay, in the next few sessions when I bridge the gap from low to high level rehab, that's valuable to me now because I know now what's going to happen. And now actually I know where I need to go. So with the ankle pain patient, I know I need to increase load tolerance through the peroneals, not just to be able to bend down, touch their toes in the clinic, but actually to navigate on even terrain. What is it that they want to get back to, which again was in the previous episode. What's the milestones? What's the dream outcome? For the other patient, the graded exposure for that person is actually managing their day-to-day life. Okay, so we have to expose them to their life again, and we have to give them strategies, we have to give them tools that allow them to act and actually get back into rest and digest. So for example, with that patient, we may put the breathing exercises at certain times of the day, set reminders for them. Okay, and then, for example, one of my tricky back pain cases that I've done clinical reasoning challenges on with you all, you'll see that with her, when her pain was going really well, and then it was just the last little bit when she left work, that's when her pain start to increase again. So what was the strategy? Before you start the engine in the car, we do 5 minutes of our breathing. We get you back into rest and digest before we drive home. Okay, so that would be an example with that type of patient. So you can see there how I've kind of built on. And again, I don't want to speak, for Louis Gifford, because I don't know if that's exactly what he was saying in his shopping basket approach. But I think the shopping basket approach is brilliant, but then it's taking it to the next level and then prioritizing where we're going to start. Now, the key benefit of that then is they're going to be able to see long-lasting changes, or certainly we're working towards long-lasting changes rather than just going, okay, well, all these things are happening, let's just take care of all these things. Okay, because the reality is, with that patient, they need a certain stimulus at a certain time up the graded exposure ladder. Okay, so that's where your objective assessment, is it now a more diagnosis-based approach, or is it actually giving you information that allows you to act? Okay, so that's where we introduce this concept in page 99. Okay, then we talk a lot about movement in the real world. Okay, and then, as I said, what's going to happen when somebody goes to reach down their outside of their knee, or when they go to touch their toes, is the brain controls the intention. So we lead with the fingertips, and then all of these things down to the levels of synergies, absorbing errors, co-contractions, influence and range of motion from the knee and the ankle. Very often you might see with that person where when we improve the co-contraction ability around the ankle by influence of the peroneals, very often that hip will travel outside the foot, create that space for the low back, and then all of a sudden that facet joint's not irritated. Okay. Once we get the diaphragm and rib cage moving with the highly stressed patient with non-physical stressors, when we reach out right hand down the right leg, my right side diaphragm needs to lengthen as my rib cage depresses. My left side diaphragm is going to shorten as my rib cage elevates. Okay, we facilitate those movements, and then very often we take that excessive load off the facet joint. Okay, so that's an example of that. Okay, so I'll talk about that. I covered that a lot in pages 100, 102, 103, and then I go into, again, more meaningful information with the next couple of layers. Okay, so for the generic objective assessment, page 107, I talk about challenging the basis support. Okay, and I actually give that, again, if you're watching this on YouTube, I'm just showing a page of the book now, I actually give that example of right hand to right knee generic objective assessment. So when we look at principles and challenging basis support, the power of that and thinking about our objective assessment of toe touch, backward bend, side flexion, rotation, when we start to think of that in challenging basis support, we now think about the nervous system feeling safe. Because ultimately, if we're accepting a definition, around a very simplified definition of, is pain an actual threat or perceived threat, then we need some way to assess perceived threat. And the ability to challenge the basis support, that's a useful tool, in my opinion, where we can gain an insight into the threat response of the nervous system. Now, of course, how they move, it's not just based on one injury. Okay, there's going to be beliefs, there's going to be habits, there's going to be observed ways of moving as a child, etc. A whole host of things, okay, going to influence that, but I think it's a useful tool. Okay, so I'll give you some examples of that, for example, on page 110, and then we go into some other bits of the objective assessment as well, which we'll cover in another episode, because this episode is progressing on a little bit now. Okay, so the big thing I wanted to cover this week is to really encourage you to reevaluate your objective assessment. Is your objective assessment giving you meaning information that's empowering you to act? Or is it just giving you a diagnosis, but it's not actually giving you the information to fix the problem in the first place? Okay, so that key critical thinking question, what isn't happening, that if it was happening, this pain would no longer be a problem in the first place? The answer to that question, okay, you're going to get probably a list of 5 or 6 issues, okay, or tissues that maybe would contribute to that movement. And then the key thing is to prioritize where to start. Where do you start? that's where then we take the meaningful information that we've got from the subjective assessment and we start to use that to actually make this specific to that back pain patient. Okay, so as I said, this is my approach that I use. It's not the only approach, of course it's not, okay? But certainly from the mentorship, when I give therapists a simple way of simplifying the assessment, getting meaningful information that empowers them to act, that's one of the key things that transforms their confidence. It transforms your ability now to actually act, transforms your ability to actually get changes with your patients quickly and safely, okay, and most importantly, long lasting. Okay, so that's it for this week. If you want to know more about the Go-To Physio mentorship method, then head over to thegotophysio.com/mentorship. Okay, if you want to pick up a copy of the book, thegotophysio.com/book. Okay, and as I said, we've got a lot of resources on the GoToPhysio.com website where we've got all the previous podcasts, we've got blog posts, we've got PDF opt-ins, so there's plenty there to check out. Okay, if you're serious about this and you want to streamline this thing, then on the website also you'll find a button that will allow you to book a call with either myself, my head physio here in the clinic, or one of my team, and we can show you how the Go-To Physiotherapist mentorship can help you become a calm, confident Go-To Physio that has the confidence to help any patient who walks through the door. Okay, that's it for this week. Have a great week ahead, changing lives, making massive impacts on people's lives, and becoming that Go-To Physio in your town. I'll see you next week.